You know, I think like many architects working today, I was very influenced by Henri Lefebvre and ideas of the production of space, and then the way that kind of manifests with Houbraken and especially Aldo van Eyck, and the ideas of space really gaining currency and meaning from inhabitation and use, right? And so the notion that the user actually transforms space through its inhabitation. And I think that's very different from the kind of early modernist, Siegfried Giedion kind of this notion of space as just an abstract universal, as opposed to something that is part of our daily lives and something that we transform through use. And so I think that does translate into experience mass, because I think the things that you then think about in terms of the manipulation of space, light, materials, tectonics, you think about them through inhabitation and how one might perceive them differently through use them much differently than originally intended, right? And that is what really, I think, gives humanity agency, you know, in terms of architecture and space. I think architecture has this extraordinary ability to say, well, look, can you visualize a different future? You know, one of climate justice, one of social justice. How can, you know, the works of drawing and modeling, all those things help people imagine themselves in a different context? I was born in Calcutta, and we moved to Tucson, Arizona when I was 2 years old, and then to Boston when I was 4. And, you know, I think Calcutta has always run in my blood, in the sense that suburban Boston especially was a fairly horrible experience. And, you know, when we were, well, I guess I was about 10, my father was a scientist, my mother was a classical musician and a librarian, so we didn't, which means we didn't have much money. We traveled though. My father would get lecture invitations, and so I remember he had one, I think, in Copenhagen. And so he took like one honorarium and split it into 4 hotel tickets and like 6 cities or something like that we did in 2 weeks. And so, you know, sure, we were seeing great museums and the great cities and plazas of Europe, but the thing that really sticks out in my mind from that trip was we were in Charles de Gaulle Airport, and we were going up one of the escalator tubes, and my 5th grade art teacher was coming up the opposite tube. Total coincidence. I think there was something in that moment that sparked this love of airports and infrastructure. And it was such a modern experience in the heart of these very, very historic cities. And that airport was, you know, it was a riff off of Pompidou and like a lot of what was going on in modern architecture at the time. And that's like one of my first architectural memories, actually, is that encounter. I went into engineering trying to be a good Indian boy, and you know, I grew up in one of those families where, you know, especially for the boys, you could be one of an engineer or a doctor, and maybe out of some crazy experience, a lawyer. But that was the range of possibility, and you know, I was fairly decent at math and so forth, and so I went into engineering school, and I was just a terrible engineering student. You know, and every elective I could take, I took in either studio art classes or art history classes. I'd done a lot of photography when I was younger and always loved to draw. And so, you know, when it came time to graduate in engineering, I just didn't want to graduate with an engineering degree. I just it was just a horrible thought. And a lot of my, you know, this was the late 80s, and a lot of people were going to Wall Street, and I clearly didn't want to do that. And so I realized that I had amassed so many credits in art and art history that if I stayed a 5th year, I could get a second bachelor's degree. And, by that point, I think my parents had largely given up, and they just sort of said, here's the student loan forms, have a blast. And I did. That was one of the great years of my life, actually, is spending it just immersed in art and art history. And, the funny thing about it is people have such interesting readings of, first of all, they think it was some strategic plan to become an architect, which it definitely wasn't. And second of all, the notion that, the engineering is the sort of practical thing that you can use, and the art history is the more, kind of liberal arts, theoretical thing. I feel like I use art history every day as much as I use engineering. Because if you think about what we do as architects, is we often have to explain the visual and the spatial to audiences who are not trained in those things, community boards, clients. And so it's actually this enormously important training in how to translate the visual into words. And so to me, it's been just as pragmatic as it has been theoretical to have that underpinning. And so it's worked out well. It was a big fat mess back then, but it's worked out well. Well, I went to architecture school very late because in between engineering and art history, I got a master's in city planning. I worked in New York for a while, and I got a master's in city planning. I was very interested in cities. Again, it was the Calcutta running in my DNA, but I spent, a lot of my time in various cities around the world. I was very fortunate, just kind of travel on a shoestring budget, saw a lot of places. And I knew I was very interested in design, but at the same time, I had a lot of questions about the relevance of architecture to society. And so when I showed up for my first week, I showed up for class for architecture school like I think just a few days before it started. Everyone else had been there for a month, and they had apartments, and I was sleeping in the YMCA on plastic sheets, and because I just wasn't sure. And then 2 weeks later, there was no turning back. I was completely enamored. And it was also kind of an inflection point in pedagogy because I used to teach undergraduate students hand-constructed perspectives. That's how old I am. And my thesis was on rapidograph and all of that. Now, I don't know if I could do any of that today, but so a lot of my early memories are very visceral and physical in terms of learning how to draw, learning how to model, very hands-on kinds of things in terms of understanding that. And then I was very fortunate. I had tremendously good instruction in form, in the idea of form, the theory of form, the performative nature of form. And so I'm very thankful to the group of teachers that I had: Stanley Sadowitz, Renee Chow, Tom Chastain, just extraordinary, Del Santos, extraordinary teachers. In terms of, it's nice to hear that young people are inspired by that. I think it's required two things that are really important for especially younger people to understand. One is the enormous amount of research, and if the New York Times editorial board is going to publish something, or the op-ed page rather is going to publish something, the fact checking that has to go into it. So your policy chops have to really be there, right? You can't just conjecture. There's an enormous amount of work that goes into that. The second thing is each of those projects, the Penn Station thing, the Not Your Car thing, all that stuff, it's very expensive to produce. And my parents came here with $32, right? So that work is cross-subsidized by an operating business where everyone has to be paid fairly, and everyone needs health insurance, and everyone needs things that can help them lead good lives. And so I think sometimes especially progressively minded architects are afraid of that word business, but like all good architecture firms are also businesses, and you can't not be if you care about things like paying your people properly and giving them the benefits they need and all of those kinds of things. And so it's really important to not be shy about those issues, right? Because we're successful, that way that we can do projects like our PAU projects.